Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Sinovic. I am State's Attorney Kim Fox's Chief External Affairs Officer. For many of you, this might be your first or returning Reporter 101, where we get back down to basics around things within our office. Today, we're focused on gun data as we get into the summer months, which we often see a rise in violence in Chicago. And so we have Matthew Thaney here, who is our Chief Data Officer, and he will be presenting some slides for you all. Nora Gregory is also on this meeting, and she will be available to answer questions at the end. She's a data integration analyst for our data team. And the run of show will be the State's Attorney Fox will do a quick introduction. Then she will pop it over to Matthew Thaney, who will go through the presentation. At the culmination of his presentation, we will be taking questions. The questions that we will be answering are not specific to any cases, but instead, generally speaking about gun data, violence, anything kind of on a grand level here. As time permits, we'll take as many questions as we can, and then we will culminate. We will have this presentation available after the fact. I believe it's being recorded. If not, the slide deck at least will be able to be shared with you all if you want it. So if you do want to request a copy of it, you can request that from the email address that you RSVP'd to. But with that, I'm going to pop it over to Matthew Thaney, our Chief Data Officer, who will walk you through data as it relates to guns in Cook County. Matthew?
Actually,
I'm
Sarah,
sorry. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the slide. I took a second ahead of myself. Let's pop it first over to the State's Attorney. State's Attorney Kim Fox is going to do an introduction.
Thank you, Sarah, and I too am anxious to get to Matthew's presentation, so I won't prolong my welcome. I did want to take the opportunity to welcome you all to today's presentation. As Sarah has indicated, we have tried over the course of the last several months and in fact years to be transparent with how we are looking at data, particularly around issues that are most pressing to the residents of Cook County. I want to start by saying, as a reminder that this is novel, these types of presentations and the availability and accessibility of this information to the public. When I came into office in 2016, this office had never had a chief data officer, which is what Matthew's role is with the office. And in fact, novel in that there were no other chief data officers who were working in prosecutors' offices to make this information available and to be able to assess trends, to be able to look deeper beyond just a headline or a case, but to look at data over time to assess our efficacy, our work, to be able to assure the people of Cook County that we are in fact doing what our mandate says around public safety. In the last 4.5 years, since we've been in office and since Matthew has been here now about 4 years, we have seen roles like Matthew pop up in other prosecutors' offices across the country. There are now about a dozen prosecutors' offices who have taken the mandate of looking at data and having in-house data analysts do this work, where again, just 4.5 years ago, it didn't exist. What we always say when we talk about data, and I know many of you on this call are experts in this work, it's not perfect. This is not meant to be definitive of we know what the answers are. But what this is meant to do is to be able to look from a 30,000-foot level and to pose the set of questions that we should be asking. A lot of times, and I recognize this as an elected official, as a political leader, people want soundbite quick answers. People want me to be able to explain why shootings are up in 2020 in 20 words or less. And the reality and the truth is it's messy. The truth is that there are a lot of factors. And the truth is that sometimes that we see things in 2020 that we might have seen in 1992, and we should be able to find a through line in that. And that's what today is about. It's not about quick and simple answers. It's not about finger pointing or assessing blame. It's about what does the information tell us? how do we reach solutions, and how do we do this in a way in which the people who have the responsibility of informing the public understand it. Your understanding of how we do our work is incredibly important to us, which is why we're doing this today. You are the storytellers. And we recognize, particularly as it relates to violence and gun violence, and the horrors that so many families across our county and across our country face, that responsibility is immense. And so what today is about the nuts and bolts, the looking under the hood, to help you to be able to articulate those stories as thoughtfully and as informed as possible. And so with that, I want to introduce Matthew Saney and Nora Gregory, who is our data integration analyst, who have worked on this presentation for you, and we look forward to your input. Matthew.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And good morning, everyone. I am very excited to be with you. I am very excited to share some of these findings, some of this analysis that we've done. I want to acknowledge Nora. I'll be doing most of the speaking today just out of practicality, but she has done an incredible work just helping put together this information. She's not alone in that. There's a larger team that's been working in many ways to help us make sure that we understand and are looking at things in the most correct way and thoughtful way possible. I also want to take a minute to acknowledge that because there's so many ways to slice and dice this data, I promise you that we are probably not going to present the information that everyone is looking for in this call, right? If you want to know what gun cases about Cicero that come through Cicero to our office look like, we don't have a slide on that. That said, we do want to provide space to allow you to ask questions, whether there are specific nuanced things like that example or broader ideas that you want to ask us about. And then the other part of this that I really do want to take a minute to acknowledge is that I'm going to be walking through a lot of charts, a lot of graphs, talking about process, and it's going to be a bit dry, and it's going to be a bit emotionless, and that's just kind of the nature of data. But we're talking about gun and gun violence here, and so what we actually are talking about people's lives, communities that are hurting, and a lot of trauma, and so. It's really important to acknowledge this. My interest in gun violence didn't start because I started working at the state's attorney's office. My interest in gun violence started because in 2013, I had a friend get shot that I played basketball with, I ran with, and he happened to be out late at night in a wrong place, wrong time, and ended up taking a couple bullets in his leg. And so then I spent the next, 6 months visiting him in the hospital, watching him recover. And that's a fortunate story where he actually was able to get use of his leg back. We've played basketball since then. We've ran since then. It's really exciting. But what he went through, right, is something that I don't want anyone to go through. And as he was recovering, unfortunately, another incident happened in my life where a cousin that I'm pretty close with lost her husband to random gun violence. They'd only been married for about 1.5 years, and she unfortunately still suffers with that trauma and is dealing with that. So we're going to talk a lot about guns. We're going to show a lot of numbers. It's going to be dry and emotionless, but please know that when we do this analysis, we understand, what we are looking at is more than just numbers. And so that's just where I want to start this. So we're going to walk through a few kind of narratives that are out there in the general public to help kind of explain what actually is happening with gun violence, gun cases that we see. And so the first narrative, right, that's out there is Kim Foxx is soft on gun crime. And you can find this in countless articles. It's a really easy one. It feels like low-hanging fruit. And so from that narrative, I want to take some time to actually show what the data says. And then you all watching this can decide if you think this is a soft on crime approach, hard on crime approach, somewhere in between, because there is a subjectiveness to it by all means. But before I can get into the actual data, I think it's important for you to understand what our office does. This may be review for some of you, this may be new for some of you, but there are a couple things that are important about what our office does. Our office initially reviews cases that are brought to us by law enforcement. We do not arrest people. Sorry about that. We do not arrest people. We have an ethical burden to only charge offenses that the evidence warrants. If a person's been arrested, a charging decision has to be made within 48 hours. In our office, we are not reviewing felony narcotics cases or misdemeanors. Instead, law enforcement direct files these cases. And so this first few slides I'm going to show you is about that charging decision and what is happening in charging decisions that are gun related. So here, going back to 2011, based on the data that we track in our own system, you can see our the gun cases that have been brought to us and our charging decisions in those gun cases. The dark blue are cases we charged. The yellow are cases we rejected. The gray line is our charging rate. You'll notice that approximately in the middle of the slide is when the Fox administration takes place. And you'll see that subsequently every year since the Fox administration has been in place, up until 2021, which is only halfway done, we have actually charged more gun cases than the previous year. We've seen steady growth year over year. It's actually been about a 62% growth to date. When we split this out a bit and look at gun cases brought to us by CPD and gun cases brought to us by other law enforcement agencies, the trend actually holds true as well. One thing to note is we get many more gun cases from the Chicago Police Department than we do from every other police department that we work with combined. Makes a lot of sense. Chicago is about 2/3 of the population that we're responsible for. And obviously, Chicago has a history of gun violence specifically that is something that would make us believe that we would see more of these cases. I want to point out a couple things here that it's a bit interesting. So we talked about 2016 was when the Fox administration started. You'll notice that we actually see a little bit of a decline in our approval rate. It's a little bit more pronounced for CPD and a little bit less pronounced for non-CPD. That decline is actually a result of us putting in stronger evidence standards and approval standards to our cases. And what you'll see is that over time that starts to climb back up. Those approval rates. And what we did was not only did we put in these standards, but then we spent time working with our law enforcement partners to help them understand what brings us a stronger case. And later on in this, I'll kind of show you the implications of getting a stronger case and approving a stronger case on the front end when we look at what happens to the case further down the process. We also, beyond just splitting it out between CPD and non-CPD, we can split it out by thinking about non-violent gun cases and violent gun cases. And when we look at non-violent gun cases, we actually see this growth pretty pronounced, that non-violent gun cases are growing. You also see that the dip in approval rates actually got under 90% for non-violent gun cases in 2018. Now, I may have said a phrase there that doesn't make sense to you initially or you haven't thought of before, and that would be nonviolent gun offense, right? I think a lot of people in their mind think of all gun crime as violent, and it's really understandable. A gun to most people is a violent object inherently, and so it makes sense that we would think of all gun crime as violent. But we actually have two different types of gun crime that we prosecute in Cook County. One is the crime itself is the possession of the gun, and that is what we classify as a non-violent gun. We have no idea if that person who possesses the gun has any intention of using that gun in an illegal way beyond possessing it, or if they're going to create violence with it. And so I think it's an important distinction to be thinking about these cases. We have another type of gun case, right? And this is the one that I think, we're more acutely aware of and concerned about, generally speaking. And this is violent gun cases, right? This is someone, regardless of whether the gun is illegal or not illegal, taking a gun and pointing it at someone and then using it to take something away from them. That's armed robbery. Or firing your gun at someone, which would be aggravated battery with a firearm. There are a bunch of variations on using the gun in some way, and ultimately we classify those as violent gun cases. So I just shown you a growth in charging of nonviolent gun cases. Here's what violent gun cases look like. A couple things I want to point out here. One, the number of violent gun cases that are being brought to us is going down over time, and this is very real. The approval rate that we have for violent gun cases is very high. It's over 95%. It's about 5% higher than nonviolent gun cases. So the cases that are being brought to us, we feel pretty confident about. We're able to charge them very regularly. We're just not getting a ton of them. And this decline actually appears, we see some sign of it showing up in 2013, 2014, 2015. So it's not necessarily a new phenomenon that's showing up in under the Fox administration, but just a general phenomenon on the types of arrests that are happening with regards to gun cases. The second step in the role of the prosecution is to secure the conviction. You charge someone with a crime, and in the United States, you're innocent until proven guilty. And then as a result of that, it is the responsibility of the person who charged you to then make the case and prove that you were guilty. Convictions happen in one of three ways. It happens with pleading of guilt, a finding of guilt, or a verdict of guilt. So when we look at convictions and conviction rates, what we do is we look at every version of guilty a person could have, and then divide that by every case that was closed in that time period. We talk about a case being closed as a case that has, an outcome of guilty or an outcome of not guilty. Outcomes of not guilty could be we chose to dismiss the case, there was a finding of not guilty, there was a verdict of not guilty. Unfortunately, sometimes the individual charged will pass away before the end of the before the case comes to an end. So we have various outcomes like that are factored in to closed cases. So looking at the cases that are getting convicted, again, going back to 2011, what we see actually is that starting in 2017 and continuing through 2019, we actually see an uptick in our conviction rate. It went from about 75% in 2016 in gun cases to over 80% for those 3 years. Now, again, looking at 2020 and 2021, you'll see that overall numbers are dipping, and you'll see that the conviction rate has dropped to about 70%. We'll unpack that a bit, but really what we're seeing is a bit of an effect of the court closures because a lot of cases can't move forward. The result is that we have a lot of cases in limbo that will likely play out with guilty verdicts once the courts can start moving them through, but they have yet to have that process happen. So this is what we're seeing with our general conviction rate across all gun cases that's been happening. If we split this out by violent versus nonviolent gun cases, there are a couple things that are interesting that pop here. Again, similarly to our approval rates are higher for violent gun cases, our conviction rates are higher for violent gun cases. It's closer and actually breaks 85% on occasion. We actually see that same uptick that took place starting after 2016 going into 2017 with our conviction rates on violent gun cases. And then you'll notice even before COVID hits, we start to see a decline in the number of cases that are being prosecuted each year, in part because that's playing out the decline in the number of cases that are being brought to us. So overall, we're convicting people with that we're charging with violent crimes, violent gun crimes, and we're doing it at a higher rate than historically in the last 10 years. When we look at nonviolent gun cases, right? Nonviolent gun cases, you'll notice that there's a slightly lower conviction rate. It drops roughly 5 to 10 percentage points, depending. You'll notice that the number of cases that get prosecuted each year is going up, at least up until 2019. Then you see those same effects with the impact of COVID, and you'll notice that the COVID effect is pretty pronounced on our conviction rate. Often, those are cases that, again, are going to be pending, and that those convictions that would have happened in 2020 or early in 2021 will likely start happening toward the end of 2021 and into 2022. So once we get a secure conviction, now the final step is sentencing. And sentencing is something that is really determined by the judge that presides over the sentencing. When an individual decides to plead guilty, the prosecution and defense may have already agreed to a predetermined sentence, but again, that agreement would be reviewed by the judge. Depending on the charge that the individual is found guilty of, the sentencing requirements and options may change. So, different gun cases have, minimums or have opportunities for certain programs, and I'll speak to that in a minute. When there isn't an agreement between prosecution and defense on sentencing, the prosecution may ask for a specific sentence based upon the facts of the case and then other information such as criminal history. But again, the decision is ultimately the judge's. So here's what we see with conviction, with sentencing. Each year, this is looking at the breakdown of the different sentences for gun cases each year. No matter what year we're looking at, the majority of people end up with some type of detainment sentence, prison or jail. Prison or jail. Starting in 2017, we noticed that there's a growth in our probation. And the growth in the probation sentences is in part due to that growing population of non-violent gun offenders that are being charged, as well as the fact that a law was put into place starting in 2018, which is where you've noticed the pronounced growth here, that created a probation program called the First Time Weapon Offender Program. This is not a Cook County law or an internal policy decision made by our office, but instead a state law that was put into place to deal with this type of crime, these first-time gun offenders, non-violent gun offender type crimes. Just to kind of explain how this probation works, it's about a 2-year program. If you don't do anything to violate your probationary terms, then the guilty verdict that you ended up pleading to initially would get nullied after the 2 years and successful completion of the program. So it is an opportunity for these people who might have made a mistake to kind of navigate through the system and come out without being permanently marred or marked, if you will, with a conviction by their mistake. So that was a breakdown of what our office is doing on prosecuting gun cases. From that standpoint, again, you may say, like, look, you're not charging 100% of your cases, or you're not getting, 99% of convictions. You're soft on crime, and that's a subjective decision that someone can make. But looking at those numbers and even comparing them to numbers that were, 5 to 10 years ago, it doesn't look like we're getting any softer on crime, at the very least, at the prosecutor's office. This next misconception that is out there is bond reform is causing gun violence. And this is one that's had a big narrative. It seems like it's changing. The WBEZ did a story a few weeks ago that brought to light some analysis that suggested that, while there are people out on bond that get arrested for crimes, it's not a significant amount of people to really impact the gun violence that Chicago's feeling or experiencing. And so I wanted to start off by actually sharing that analysis with you. That analysis was done by our office. It was presented to criminal justice partners. It was done because there was this conversation about this revolving door where the narrative was said, on a Thursday, we arrest someone, put them in jail. By Friday morning, they're bonded out. By Sunday, they're committing another gun crime. And, the question that we had to ask ourselves was, if this is true, right, we need to do something about it. But we had to first find out if it's true, right? And so we used the arrest data that we received from Chicago Police Department and looked for repeat offenders amongst that arrest data. And we did find some, but it was about 1% or 24. And then we kind of expanded the criteria because there's many ways to slice and dice this. And we were able to, get to about 3%. So is there a population? Yes. Is it a driving population? At least for the people that end up getting arrested for gun crimes? It does not seem like it. It's not 20, 30%, or over 50%. So for this presentation, I wanted to kind of dive into that a bit more. Should also explain that the reason we are using this time frame of people cycling in the system, right? And for this analysis, what we did was looked at people during 2020. I believe the analysis was done in late July of 2020. But the reason we're using kind of watching how frequently people are passing through the system is because we have limitations in the data that we have and knowing whether or not someone is out on bond. This is something that we've been working on. We've been working on improving our data across many different avenues, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways we've done that already. But as of right now, it's very hard for us to say specifically that a person is out on bond at any given moment. And so what we're using is a proxy of, is that person getting rearrested in a frequent manner? So here is looking back all the way to the beginning of 2020. And what you're seeing are gun arrests that take place each month. That's the total of both the blue and yellow bar. And what the dark blue part is that person had no previous arrests in the 365 days prior to the arrest that made them show up on this graph. The yellow part is they had a previous arrest in the last 365 days. So overall, we actually, and this is Cook County wide, this is all law enforcement, right? Overall, we actually see that the population that's has a recent arrest is about 12.5%. I'm not going to pretend that's like a nothing population. That's like a decent sized population, but I think that it bears to have some unpacking to truly understand what is going into that 12.5% to better frame, what are these drivers of gun violence and is bond reform actually impacting gun violence in a negative way? So the first thing we're looking at is of that population, how many of them that previous arrest was for something that we did not consider violent and did not consider gun related, right? What is violent and not gun related? A narcotics case, right? Not gun related necessarily, not violent. Some type of theft, right? Those are the type of cases that would fall into this category. We see that half of that 12% population, ultimately falls into this more benign, I will say, type of previous arrest, right? So, okay, what's going on with that other 6%, right? So about 1/3 of that 12%, 4.6% of the people getting arrested do have a previous gun arrest. It's a non-violent gun arrest. Again, it's for possession of a gun. And knowing that we've put reforms statewide around probation with first-time gun offenders, and knowing that it's an inherently a non-violent offense. These are individuals that are receiving bond, so it's not surprising to see some of them getting rearrested down the road. But it's still a small number across the whole county at the end of the day. We're talking about 4.6%. And we'll explore further on these nonviolent gun cases that keep coming in and kind of what's happening with them. But there's nothing to necessarily suggest that these individuals who are getting arrested for a nonviolent gun case are actively participating in gun violence. There's one working theory out there that suggests that these are individuals that are carrying guns in their car because they live in dangerous neighborhoods and they haven't gone through the proper mechanisms to acquire that gun or to acquire a FOID card or conceal carry or whatever the appropriate piece is. I'm not going to say that it's a working theory. I'm not going to say that that's 90% of this 4.6. I'm not going to say it's 10% of it, but I do think it's at least a reasonable thing to consider on what's happening with this particular population. So now we're looking at the violent gun cases that are showing up in these people being arrested for guns. And it's about 1.3 or 1/10 of those that overall rearrest population. So again, there is someone with some type of violent gun case that happened to have been out that ended up getting rearrested within a year's time period, every month. There is some population of it. But to suggest that this population is driving the violence in the city of Chicago is a little bit of a stretch, in my opinion. It is such a small population that I don't think if we made this zero, we would see shootings in Chicago drop in a significant manner. There's a fourth category I want to flag. These are individuals that the previous arrest was for some type of violent gun case, a violent case, but not gun related. So think about aggravated battery, domestic violence, things of that nature. These cases, this population also makes up about 1%. So there are people that, have done violence with a gun. We see them showing up here occasionally in our future arrests. We see people that have done general violence. They show up occasionally. But again, it's not the population these are not the people that are driving the population that's getting arrested for gun crimes in the city. And likely that means that these are not the people that are getting arrested that are driving gun violence in the city. So with that misconception kind of changing a bit in the public narrative, there's a new misconception that's growing that's a derivative of it, and it's electronic monitoring is causing gun violence. And this is something that is a bit more recent in narrative and are getting folks often a bit excited. And so spend some time digging into this as well. With bond, we don't know when someone is out on bond. With electronic monitoring, we started working with the sheriff's office back in September to get a live feed of everyone that's in their custody. So at any given point, we can tell if someone is on electronic monitoring starting in mid-September. This has been incredibly helpful for us to understand what is happening with electronic monitoring. And again, to think about how we better make decisions within our office around recommending people to potentially be on electronic monitoring and things of that nature. It's also important to note that both because of COVID and wanting to depopulate the jail and the general nervousness about putting new people that were formerly in jail out in general, there's a larger utilization and reliance on electronic monitoring that's being done. And that's being primarily driven by the courts, by the judges, as it acts as a little bit of, I feel comfortable letting this person out, but I want to put them on electronic monitoring. So looking at electronic monitoring, going back to September, and September is partial and June, is month to date, we find that on average, 2% of the people that are arrested for guns each month were on electronic monitoring at that time. Again, small population. This population would actually overlap with our previous analysis of people that had a previous arrest. You have to have a previous arrest to show up on electronic monitoring. So we're talking a little bit of overlap right here. But again, to suggest that the electronic monitoring population is causing the gun violence just seems very far-fetched because it's such a small population. We can do further digging into this, right? So because we know who's on EM at any given moment, we can do analysis about what is happening with them at any given moment. Since September 15th, 705 people have been arrested on EM. 104 of those have been for gun arrests. During this 266-day period, the EM population has ranged from about 3,600 to about 4,100. It's averaged about 3,900 on daily basis. On average, 2.7 people on EM get arrested daily. That amounts to 0.07%, 0.07% of a percentage of that population. It is a very small number of people that are getting arrested every day on EM, and that's the broad EM population. So if we dive into this and look at gun offenders that are on EM, right, we see that there's a significant amount of gun offenders on EM. There are has ranged from anywhere from 1,400 to about 1,700, and we average about 1,680 people on EM that are there for a gun offense. They account for about 278 of all arrests and 57 of all gun arrests. They don't even account for all the gun arrests, by the way. Other people are accounting for the gun arrests. On average, one person on EM for a gun case gets arrested daily. That's an even smaller fraction, 1/100th of a percentage of that population. There's been conversation about people charged with murder, accused of murder on EM as well. And so looking at that population, it's ranged from 54 to 96. And it averages about 75 people daily. They've accounted for 9 arrests, and only one of them being a gun arrest. I didn't bother calculating the percentages because they're just that small, and it doesn't. I don't even know how to pronounce the numbers, quite frankly. I want to take a minute to kind of show you what people are getting arrested for when they're on EM, so you have some contextualization of this. This is, again, same time period, the top 10 most common EM arrests that we see. Number 1 falls in the category of escape. This is probably not surprising. It can be anything from, someone actively tampering with their electronic monitoring device to sometimes these arrests happen as like false positives and then ultimately get cleaned up later on. But this is the most common thing that happens. You'll notice that halfway down the page, kind of buried in there, homicide shows up. And obviously homicide is an incredibly serious crime. We've got 17 people that were arrested for homicide. A couple of things I want to flag here. One, it's actually the population that didn't have a murder case or a gun case that is driving the homicide arrests over gun offenders or over accused murderers. But then the second thing that's interesting is homicide cases themselves take a long time to work up, understandably so. And so it's very plausible that a good portion of these people getting arrested for homicide, the incident happened before they were ever on electronic monitoring. Some analysis done by the sheriff's office last summer showed 6 people that were on electronic monitoring ended up getting arrested for homicide. 4 of those 6 people, the homicides happened prior to them being put on electronic monitoring. So I don't know the specifics about these 17 cases. I just haven't had the opportunity to dig into them. Don't want to try to hide the ball from anyone here and acknowledge it. But again, I don't think that this is the, looking at EM, looking at these numbers, I don't think it's fair to say that this is the cause of gun violence in our city, unfortunately, or a driver of gun violence in our city, unfortunately. So kind of talked about bond reform, EM, big narratives. Next big narrative that's happening is, gun violence is skyrocketing in Chicago. And, 2020, not a great year. Not a great year in a lot of respects. But I want to kind of walk through some of this data and try to do a little bit of level setting on how bad 2020 was and how bad it looks compared to other years. So here is shooting data starting from May of this year, going all the way back to January 2010. It's the number of shootings that have been tracked in Chicago each month. You'll notice that on the far right, when we look into 2020, those bars are pretty high and higher than most of the other bars. So it is noteworthy to suggest that 2020 did have a lot of shootings in it. There's no other way to say that, right? But it's also important to kind of put this in perspective. You'll notice something in this graph. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but you'll kind of see that it's like a bunch of little mountains, right? They're roughly 10 mountains, if you will, across this page. And what that is you're seeing seasonal effects that correlate with crime, with shootings, with murders, right? When the weather gets nicer, particularly in a place like Chicago, where the weather can be pretty rough in the winter, people are out and more active, and there are more shootings, murders, crimes generally happening in the summer months. So when we want to actually understand how different one month is from the rest of the months, it's really not fair to compare June to January, because January just looks different than June, right? So what we want to do is compare June to all the other Junes, Januaries to all the other Januaries. With only 10 years of data, it means we only get 10 months to actually do that comparison. And so it's a bit of a limited comparison. And trying to understand how much of an anomaly or how different things are, getting more data always helps make things better. So, limitations in shooting data kind of ends it in early 2010. But a good proxy for shootings is murder. And this is murder data going back 10 years. And if you kind of look through the two different slides, you see that they have a similar pattern, right? They have the same peaks and valleys. You see 2020 was also a pretty gross year for murder. You see the same increase in 2016 as well. And so this plays as a good proxy. And the Tribune, this actually came from the Tribune, did this great article where they actually looked at murder going back about 60 years. And so here is the murder each month that took place in Chicago going back 60 years. And what's great about this is no longer do I have 10 Januaries to compare last January to and 10 Julys to compare last July to. Now I have 60 Januaries and 60 Julys. And I can start to see how much variance there actually is in these different months. And so to kind of keep this visual and get out of the nerdy wonky numbers of it, what I did was go through and color the bars. If a bar is colored red, it means that it is a significantly higher month. So, a significantly higher September compared to all the Septembers. If it's colored green, it's a significantly lower month. It means it's, a significantly lower September compared to all the Septembers. And if it falls in the yellow, it's what we would consider falling in the range of natural distribution. That it's kind of falling in the expected place it would be, right? So from that standpoint, what you see is going back 60 years, Chicago's had a lot of variance in the amount of shooting that's happened. The 90s were notorious and were violent. You can see a lot of violence showing up in the 70s into the 80s as well. But we can also zoom in and get a better understanding for what took place most recently. Zooming in to 2016 through today, you'll notice that in 2020, looking at murder, we had 4 big outlier months: May, June, July, and September. And these are bad months, and they're actually very bad months as far as murder goes. June and July were the worst June and Julys that we've had going back 60 years. So that's bad. There's no way to spin that or say that otherwise. May was the second worst May. September was the 6th worst September, right? But what we see coming out of that is things start to settle down and get to a place where we would generally expect them to be. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that that May, June, July, September, or even last summer was a good time for Chicago with regards to murder or with regards to shooting. But I don't know if we're at a point where we've established a new pattern of violence that we should expect in our city. We're just beginning this summer, right? I don't want to sit here and say it's going to be X number of shootings in June and Y number of shootings in July, or X number of murders in June and X number of murders in July. There are a lot of factors that will come into that, but we haven't fundamentally changed kind of coming out of that hot summer. And the other big thing to keep in mind is that we had a phenomenon that I don't know if you want to call it once in 100 years or however you want to frame it, but we had COVID lockdown beginning right at the beginning of that. And that's where we start to see the peaking in the shooting. We start to see the peaking in the murder. And, it's really hard to disentangle those two ideas from each other. Life just changed for a lot of people in the month of March, and in challenging ways, unfortunately. So the final misconception I want to walk through here is the idea that more policing is needed to solve gun violence. Obviously, there's good policing and bad policing, and policing itself, is a big challenge. And so, I'm going to try to get out of the nuance of all the different ways to police. But I do think that this idea of constantly throwing policing at the problem to solve gun violence may not continue to reap rewards to some degrees. Come back to arrests, right? We've seen gun arrests growing in Chicago year over year since 2004, or in Cook County year over year since 2014. We're projected to see the most gun arrests that we've seen, I would venture to guess ever. I don't have data enough going back enough in time to benchmark it against other things, but I would suspect to guess that 2020 is the highest number of gun arrests we'll ever seen in Cook County ever. The other interesting thing is coming out of 2016, the spike in violence, there was a huge demand and request, and then ultimately funding for more policing, more police officers, more police resources. So initially looking at this, you're like, okay, great. We see an uptick in people getting arrested right after we see an influx of resources given to policing. So, this should be accomplishing something, right? We're kind of doing the thing that we expect it to do. We're putting the gas on the gas. We're putting the pressure on the gas pedal, and we do more policing, we get more arrests, right? And when we break this out, right, we can even see that it's by non-CPD and CPD. We see that this is even more pronounced by non-CPD, right? Or sorry, by CPD, that the growth is even bigger, right? And again, makes sense. That resourcing stimulus essentially primarily went to them. And so, we'd expect to see a changed behavior of that, right? When we split this out, now we're looking at non-CPD, nonviolent gun arrests, and CPD, nonviolent gun arrests. And again, this becomes even more pronounced, right? We see more and more nonviolent gun folks getting arrested by CPD. We see more and more nonviolent gun folks getting arrested by non-CPD. But when we look at violent gun arrests, right, during the same time period, we see that outside of non-CPD, it stays relatively flat with a little bit of variance, and we see what looks to be a steady decline in violent gun arrests by CPD. And I think this, is the crux of trying to solve gun violence with policing at the end of the day. That the resources are being put out there, right? Are showing up to some degree or another. I get that there can be debates about how much resourcing is enough resourcing and all of that. But at the end of the day, when we look at this split between violent gun arrest and nonviolent gun arrest, and we see nonviolent gun arrests going down, it's hard to believe that we're solving gun violence at that point. Here's another way to look at this. Here is essentially the clearance rate for each month going back to 2011. You can see on the bar graph on the bottom, the dark blue is the number of shootings that had no arrests, and the yellow on the top is the number of shootings that ended up with an arrest. Does not consider whether we charged, does not consider whether the person was convicted, just someone was arrested for that shooting. The gray line above shows you what that clearance rate is as a result. The clearance rate's never been over 50% in any of the months in the last 10 years, right? It's not surprising. It's really hard to catch a shooter, right? They don't shoot and then stick around, right? They shoot and go away. And unfortunately, they're often have a plan on how to go away prior to doing the shooting. So it makes it very difficult to kind of show up at that point and start to police the problem because the problem has disappeared. The interesting piece of this is that the average clearance rate across this whole time period is about 27%. If we look in this period where we saw a decrease in shooting and an increase in policing resources, right, it actually dropped to 24%. And it doesn't even include the spike in violence that took place in 2020. It stops at March of 2020. This isn't an indictment on Chicago Police Department to say, oh my gosh, why can't you catch shooters? I couldn't catch shooters, right? Catching shooters is hard. I think that, we need to start thinking about how to tackle these problems differently than just trying to police our way out of them. Here's another way to kind of think about this. The dark blue line is the shootings that took place in each month in Chicago. The yellow line are the gun arrests that took place by CPD each month. Starting in 2011, we have in Chicago arrested more people for a gun crime than shootings took place each month. So it's not necessarily a question of arresting people. It's a question of arresting right people. And you'll also notice that there's a growing gap that's happening between this. That the actual, as I keep showing, the arrests are increasing and increasing and increasing in subsequent years. And so, there's a real question of what is really happening here. And so the final slide I want to kind of land on as far as data analysis goes is this slide. We can look at a lot of information we know about these arrests, and we often are trying to understand what's happening with them. We found a population that has changed drastically in the last 10 years with gun arrests. This population are individuals that are getting arrested for a nonviolent gun that we can't find any prior conviction in our system for, that were arrested via a street stop. A street stop, for those of you who are unfamiliar, usually is someone getting pulled over, but doesn't have to be someone getting pulled over. Ultimately, when an arrest is made, the location of that arrest is recorded, and if that person is stopped on the street, usually sitting in a car, then that's the title that it gets. This growth in nonviolent, no prior conviction, street stop arrests that are taking place is very pronounced by CPD. And there's a huge shift that actually takes place around 2016, where 2011 to 2016, kind of little variance doing its thing. 2017 jumps, 2018 jumps, 2019 jumps, 2020 jumps. We didn't put the projection of 2021, but the projection is going to be bigger than 2020, right? And, there are concerns, there are questions about this, right? These are stops that, we're charging, we're prosecuting, right? These are individuals that will likely end up back on that probation that I showed early on, right? That first time probation. And hopefully, they learn a lesson, they complete it successfully, right? But there's also the potential that we might be creating a lot of people that will forever be marked as a felon, and then have to make different life choices as a result of this. It's very unlikely that a lot of these individuals that are getting arrested are involved in actual gun violence. Unfortunately, it's possible that they are. I'm not going to say that none of them are, but I would be hard pressed to believe that 50% of these nonviolent arrests that are showing up have been associated to violence. And honestly, some analysis that I didn't bother to include in this, but analysis of firearms that have been collected or confiscated by the Chicago Police Department. They get anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 guns a year, right? It's a pretty staggering number when you think about it. Roughly, or less than 20% of those guns ever get linked back to any type of shooting through a system that tracks through a system that the ATF uses to track, essentially the type of gun and markings of how markings inside the gun that allow you to kind of link a casing back to a crime, or a casing back to a specific gun. And so, this is the concern a bit about all this policing, right? That it's kind of pushing a new population that a couple of years from now, we might have to think about how this impacts the way that our communities exist. kind of want to leave you on this, right? Showed a bunch of articles. Recently this last week, there was an editorial from the LA Times, and they're speaking very much about California in this, but what they're saying in California applies to Cook County because we've done a lot of similar things and had a lot of similar experiences over the last year. But there's a real question of how we choose to kind of resource going forward. That this spike in violence that did exist last summer and existed not just in Chicago, but in Washington D.C., in L.A., in New York, in Baltimore, in Detroit. Do we go back to the methods that we've been using for so long that helped get us to this point? Or do we start thinking about new methodologies of dealing with these issues to try to break the cycle that unfortunately a lot of other decisions that maybe weren't criminal justice related in our communities created? And so with that, I want to open it up to questions.
We have a question from Carlos.
Sure.
Says it's directed to you, Matthew. Thanks for the presentation. You mentioned that only 20% of guns recovered by police are linked back to a shooting investigation. Can you perhaps walk us through how to get those figures? Thank you. If anyone else has any questions, please submit them in the question feature and we'll get through them after Matthew's done talking about this one.
So I don't have a great methodology for you, Carlos, to kind of get your hands on that data. It was something that I was privy to a presentation a while ago, and was just shocked at the number of it. There are a few things. I know a little bit about this. This is not my wheelhouse, right? Forensics evidence is like a whole complicated world, and so I don't want to overrepresent or underrepresent anything here. It's intentionally kind of why I didn't try to do anything bigger with this. But there's rifling in a barrel that impacts the way that like a bullet and a casing kind of come out, and there's essentially like a bit of a signature on that that happens. And so as a result, that you can make a match between a firearm and evidence recovered at a shooting scene. There are things that can impact the ability for that match to be made, just as like a fingerprint could be there, but if it got smudged, it's hard to match. And so, it's hard to know exactly how much of that is getting impacted by like, hitting a wall or whatever else that prevented the match from making it happen. But it's another directional signal that we see that yes, we're doing a lot of work about gun crime, and yes, we're making progress, but maybe we're not putting the energy in the places that's going to yield the biggest fruit to stop gun violence.
I think you can all hear me, even if you can't see me. Does anyone else have any further questions on any of this presentation? I think Matthew made a good point here that in order for us to prosecute anyone, we have to have an arrest from law enforcement, which is a big portion of the function of how the criminal justice system works. I'll keep it open for just a couple more seconds. If you have any questions, there is a question feature on your screen. You can submit it written. I don't see any others coming in. Okay, give it a couple seconds. The state's attorney is going to close us out, pending no more questions. We'll give it just a few more seconds. You can, if you desire to see this presentation and have the deck sent to you, please make a request via sao.media@cookcountyil.gov. The same email that you RSVP'd to, and we can get that to you today. Otherwise, if you have further follow-up questions, you can also respond to that email and we can provide clarity as we can. We don't have any additional questions, so I'm going to pop it over to State's Attorney Fox for the closeout.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Matthew and Nora and our data team. Thank you to those of you who have attended this morning's presentation. As Matthew said, it's a lot of information, a lot of numbers, but also I want to circle back to the point that he made when he began, that these are people's lives, that these are communities that are impacted by every shooting, by every death that we see on a daily basis, and recognize the tremendous responsibility that you all have to tell those stories, the stories of loss, the stories of community, and what it means. And as dry as sometimes data presentations can be, I did want to circle back that, you know, it is not our intent in any way by using numbers to minimize the impact that gun violence has had on our community here in Cook County. What we did want to do, however, is to be able to have nuanced conversations about what is driving violence, about policy, and to do it in a way that is rooted in information. We don't say that our data is perfect. As you get the slide deck, you'll see that we've pulled it from many different sources, whether it's CPD data, our internal data, the sheriff's data, to try to get a complete picture. Can you hold one moment? Sorry, it's what happens when you work from home and there are people at your door. But we've culled this information from a variety of sources to be able to give as complete a picture that we can. It's also important for me to say, when we talk about violence in our communities, as Matthew started, it is really personal. There's not a person, I think, who lives in this county who doesn't know that I grew up in a violence-plagued neighborhood, that I introduced myself to the Cook County voter by talking about how I used to hide in a bathtub when violence and gunshots would ring out. It is so important to the people who live in these neighborhoods, who live in these communities, who are fearful for their children, for their elders, who are understandably shaken by the information that they see on the news, that they believe that the people who they've elected or put in positions are working collectively and collaboratively to solve for the violence in our communities. It is important that we work, both state, county, and city, together to address not just the response to violent crime, but also to prevent violence from happening in the first place, which I think is the crux of the end of the presentation of all of the things that we're doing on the back end. Where can we stop the bullet from being pulled in the first place? As Sarah said, our office gets involved after a trigger has been pulled, after a chalk outline has been drawn, after an arrest has been made. And I know for many people, it seems that we have an outsized role in our justice system. We're part of a bigger ecosystem, and we own the responsibility that we have. And our responsibility is to be transparent about how we do our work, to know and recognize trends, as we've seen, not just in this administration or not just in the last 10 years, but as far back as we can go, and to work with all of you to answer your questions, to sit with you as you assess the data. Data that's not understandable to people who have to report on it is not worth the paper that it's written on. And so that's why we do this. This is not an attempt to steer a narrative. Oftentimes we are responding to a narrative. And I think it is critically important, particularly as we enter into these summer months. Again, as we see violence on the rise here in Cook County, and Matthew gave a list of cities of where violence is rising, and they all happen to be, you know, big cities, but we see it in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to places where there's conservative law and order leadership in prosecutors' offices. Violence is on the rise everywhere. And as we reckon with that, it is my hope that these types of presentations, this type of information, and your engagement with us, with Matthew and his team, gets us to real solution and not sensationalism. And so again, I just want to thank you all for taking your time to listen to this presentation today, and look forward to your continued engagement and sharing the information that we have with you. Any questions that you may have or anything that you think need to be more clear, or how this presentation can be more fruitful to you and to your colleagues, we welcome your feedback. We welcome your input. And again, we look forward to ongoing engagement as we tackle truly what is the most pressing issue in Cook County right now, which is gun violence. With that, I thank you for your time and attention this morning.